Woody Allen was editing Annie Hall when he realized he'd accidentally filmed his own nervous breakdown. The movie everyone thought was a romantic comedy was actually a confession. The Academy gave him an Oscar for it. But before we dive into this story, if you enjoy untold moments from cinema history, hit that subscribe button and stay with us. It was February 19th, 1977, 2 in the morning on a bitter cold Manhattan night. Snow was falling outside the Brill Building's grimy windows as Woody Allen sat alone in his cluttered editing room on the 4th floor. The room smelled of stale cigarettes, cold coffee, and the chemical odor of film stock. Thousands of feet of celluloid were spread across multiple editing tables, covering every available surface. Empty Chinese takeout containers and overflowing ashtrays created a landscape of creative chaos that perfectly reflected Woody's mental state. He was surrounded by what he thought would be his masterpiece, but as he watched the assembled footage for the 20th time that week, a horrifying realization was slowly dawning on him. Annie Hall, the romantic comedy he'd been crafting for months, wasn't a fictional story about quirky love in Manhattan. It was something far more dangerous and personally devastating. He'd accidentally created a brutal, unflinching examination of his own psychological failures, romantic disasters, and complete inability to maintain healthy, equal relationships with women. Every scene felt like evidence being presented in a criminal trial against himself. The footage spread across his editing tables told a story Woody hadn't consciously intended to tell, but one that was undeniably true. His character, Alvy Singer, wasn't just charmingly neurotic and endearingly intellectual as he'd written him. When assembled chronologically and viewed objectively, Alvy emerged as narcissistic, emotionally manipulative, psychologically controlling, and fundamentally incapable of genuine intimacy or partnership. The relationship with Annie wasn't quirky and romantic as he'd imagined. It was a detailed case study in how intelligent, articulate, supposedly sensitive men could systematically destroy the women they claimed to love while convincing themselves they were being caring and supportive. Woody had written, directed, and starred in the film, but watching it assembled as a complete narrative, he felt like he was discovering his own psychological profile for the first time through the eyes of a stranger. This wasn't entertainment or romantic comedy. This was inadvertent psychoanalysis captured forever on 35mm film stock, preserved for posterity and public consumption. The original script had been radically different from what he was now editing. Originally titled anhedonia, a clinical term meaning the inability to experience pleasure or happiness, the film was conceived as an abstract, experimental exploration of contemporary anxiety and urban alienation. Woody had planned elaborate surreal sequences, fantasy elements that broke the boundaries of realistic storytelling, and innovative experimental narrative techniques that would challenge conventional filmmaking. The romantic relationship between the main characters was supposed to be just one small element in a much larger, more ambitious meditation on the psychological challenges of modern urban life. But during the actual filming process, something unexpected had occurred. The scenes between Alvy Singer and Annie Hall had somehow taken on a creative life of their own, becoming far more compelling and emotionally complex than anything else in the script. The dialogue between them had grown intensely personal, moving beyond the witty intellectual banter Woody had written towards something that felt uncomfortably specific and autobiographical. The relationship dynamics had evolved into something much more psychologically sophisticated and disturbing than he'd originally planned. Now, watching the assembled footage in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the editing room, Woody could see his own destructive romantic patterns playing out on screen with devastating psychological clarity. Alvy's compulsive need to control and intellectually improve Annie directly reflected Woody's documented behavior with virtually every woman he'd ever dated seriously. The condescending intellectual superiority, the cultural snobbery disguised as education, the systematic way Alvy tried to remake Annie in his own intellectual image while claiming to love and appreciate her individual differences and unique qualities. It was all there, captured forever in beautiful black and white cinematography and brilliantly witty dialogue that made the psychological manipulations seem charming rather than abusive. Diane Keaton's performance as Annie Hall had been truly extraordinary during filming, but now Woody understood why her work felt so authentically emotional and psychologically complex. She wasn't simply playing a fictional character she'd created through research and imagination. She was essentially playing herself. Or more specifically, she was playing the damaged version of herself she'd become during their actual tumultuous romantic relationship several years earlier. Every gesture, every vocal inflection, every moment of insecurity, joy, confusion, or pain was directly drawn from their real experiences together, their genuine conversations, their actual emotional dynamic. They dated intensively for several years in the early 1970s, and their relationship had been creatively stimulating, intellectually exciting, sexually passionate, and ultimately psychologically destructive. Woody had actively mentored Diane professionally, encouraging her acting career and helping her develop her craft, while simultaneously undermining her personally through constant criticism and emotional manipulation. He'd supported her professional ambitions while systematically attacking her intelligence, her cultural background, her artistic instincts, her personal judgment. He'd claimed to love her authentic self while working constantly to change everything about her personality that didn't match his intellectual ideal. The uncomfortable parallels between their real relationship and the fictional Alvy-Annie dynamic were absolutely impossible to ignore or dismiss as creative coincidence. Woody had written scenes that directly recreated actual conversations they'd had, arguments they'd experienced, moments of intimacy and betrayal that had defined and ultimately destroyed their time together. Diane had performed these emotionally brutal scenes with painful psychological authenticity because she was essentially being forced to relive her own romantic trauma for the entertainment of audiences worldwide. But the most disturbing realization for Woody came when he began analyzing the film's overall structure, thematic content, and moral perspective. Annie Hall wasn't celebrating neurotic romance or intellectual connection as he'd intended. Instead, it was systematically documenting exactly how smart, articulate, culturally sophisticated men could be profoundly emotionally abusive while convincing themselves and their victims that they were sensitive, caring, and emotionally evolved. The film was accidentally exposing everything toxic, manipulative, and destructive about Woody's fundamental approach to romantic relationships. The editing process had become an uncomfortable exercise in psychological archaeology, with each scene revealing new layers of unconscious self-incrimination. Every sequence forced Woody to examine behavior patterns he'd never consciously acknowledged or questioned. The famous lobster sequence that seemed like charming physical comedy was actually a portrait of a man who turned every shared experience into an opportunity for intellectual superiority and emotional control. The scene where Alvy systematically criticizes Annie's reading choices wasn't cute intellectual banter between lovers. It was textbook emotional manipulation, disguised as cultural education and caring guidance. Woody found himself constantly tempted to cut scenes that were too psychologically revealing, too obviously autobiographical, too potentially damaging to his public image as a sensitive artist and intellectual. But even the material that remained in the final cut painted a devastatingly accurate psychological portrait that any trained therapist could easily diagnose. He was trapped between maintaining artistic integrity and protecting his personal reputation, between creating genuinely honest art and preserving his career and relationships. The film's complex treatment of Jewish identity added another layer of uncomfortable autobiographical revelation. Alvy Singer's persistent paranoia about anti-Semitism directly reflected Woody's own documented psychological experiences growing up as Alan Stewart Konigsberg in working-class Brooklyn. The scene where Alvy imagines anti-Semitic subtext in perfectly innocent casual conversation wasn't exaggerated comedy. It was essentially documentary footage of Woody's actual psychological state during most social interactions with non-Jewish people. But the Jewish material also revealed something much darker and more manipulative about both Alvy's and Woody's character. Alvy consistently used his cultural identity and historical oppression as both defensive shield and offensive weapon, deflecting legitimate criticism of his behavior, while positioning himself as perpetually victimized and therefore beyond moral accountability. The film showed with clinical precision how intelligent, culturally aware men could weaponize their marginalized identity to avoid responsibility for their own destructive actions. The cramped editing room had essentially become a makeshift confession booth where Woody was being forced to confront overwhelming evidence of his own psychological pathology and relationship dysfunction. The film he'd intended as light entertainment had transformed into inadvertent intensive therapy, with every scene forcing him to examine his treatment of women, his emotional immaturity, his complete inability to maintain healthy partnerships based on equality and mutual respect. The creative breakthrough that would save the film came when Woody finally accepted that its true subject wasn't romance, comedy, or even urban intellectual life. Annie Hall was actually about the detailed anatomy of a relationship methodically destroyed by one person's fundamental inability to grow emotionally or psychologically. Annie gradually develops self-awareness, confidence, and independence throughout the film. Alvy remains psychologically static, emotionally stunted, and incapable of genuine change. The film documents this tragic process with scientific precision, disguised as romantic entertainment. This painful realization completely changed Woody's approach to the final edit and the film's overall structure. Instead of trying to make Alvy more sympathetic or likable, he decided to emphasize his emotional limitations and psychological dysfunction. Instead of romanticizing their intellectual connection, he chose to highlight the power dynamics, emotional manipulation, and systematic psychological abuse that characterized their relationship. The film became a clinical study in how highly intelligent people could be profoundly emotionally destructive without ever recognizing or acknowledging their own behavior patterns. The revolutionary decision to structure the narrative non-chronologically was born directly from this new understanding of the film's psychological content. By deliberately jumbling the timeline and presenting events out of sequence, Woody could demonstrate how Alvy's memories and recollections were self-serving reconstructions rather than accurate representations of what actually occurred. The fragmented structure brilliantly revealed how unreliable narrators could systematically reframe their own destructive behavior as romantic tragedy, while avoiding genuine accountability for the damage they'd caused. The innovative breaking of the fourth wall served a similar psychological purpose. When Alvy speaks directly to the camera, addressing the audience with apparent honesty and vulnerability, he's actually performing the exact same intellectual manipulation and emotional control he consistently uses on Annie throughout their relationship. The direct address becomes just another sophisticated tool of psychological manipulation, another calculated method to frame his story sympathetically while avoiding genuine responsibility or meaningful change. Working closely with veteran editor Ralph Rosenblum, Woody gradually discovered that the film's real power came from its accidental psychological honesty rather than its intentional comedy. The scenes that worked most effectively were those where Alvy's superficial charm and intellectual sophistication couldn't adequately disguise his underlying emotional violence and systematic manipulation. The moments that felt most authentically real were those where Annie's genuine pain and psychological damage became clearly visible, despite the witty dialogue and sophisticated urban setting. The film's extensive exploration of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis took on profound new meaning in this context of psychological revelation. Alvy's regular sessions with his analyst weren't evidence of progress toward emotional health and self-awareness. They were elaborate intellectual exercises that allowed him to discuss his problems extensively without actually changing his fundamental behavior or character. The therapy scenes revealed with devastating accuracy how highly intelligent people could use psychological self-awareness as a sophisticated substitute for genuine emotional growth or moral development. Annie's parallel therapy sessions provided crucial emotional counterpoint to Alvy's intellectual masturbation. Her analyst actually helps her recognize the relationship's profoundly toxic dynamics and develops the psychological strength necessary to leave permanently. The contrasting therapy scenes showed two completely different approaches to psychological understanding: Alvy's self-indulgent intellectualization versus Annie's genuine emotional development and moral courage. The film's sophisticated treatment of sexuality and physical intimacy was equally psychologically revealing. The bedroom scenes between Alvy and Annie weren't romantic, erotic, or even particularly sexual. They were clinical studies in emotional disconnection, performance anxiety, and the complete inability to achieve genuine vulnerability, even during supposedly intimate moments. Woody had accidentally created a documentary about how neurotic, intellectual men could transform even physical intimacy into abstract intellectual exercises while avoiding genuine emotional connection or mutual vulnerability. The famous scene where Annie's consciousness literally separates from her body during sex wasn't surreal comedy or creative filmmaking technique. It was a completely literal representation of how women in relationships with narcissistic, emotionally abusive men often psychologically dissociate to protect themselves from ongoing trauma. The scene captured with devastating accuracy the subtle emotional violence of seemingly consensual sexual interactions. By March 1977, after weeks of intensive editing work, Woody had assembled a rough cut that absolutely terrified him with its psychological accuracy and autobiographical revelation. The film he'd originally intended as light romantic entertainment had somehow become a devastating self-portrait that exposed his character flaws, relationship dysfunction, and emotional pathology. Every single scene contained damning evidence of behavior patterns he'd never consciously acknowledged or examined. The editing process had forced him to confront profoundly uncomfortable truths about his own psychology and his documented history of destructive relationships. Working with editor Ralph Rosenblum, Woody discovered that the film's power came from its accidental honesty rather than its intentional comedy. The scenes that worked best were those where Alvy's charm couldn't disguise his emotional violence. The moments that felt most real were those where Annie's pain was most visible, despite the witty dialogue. The film's exploration of therapy and psychoanalysis took on new meaning in this context. Alvy's sessions with his analyst weren't progress toward emotional health. They were intellectual exercises that allowed him to discuss his problems without actually changing his behavior. The therapy scenes revealed how smart people could use self-awareness as a substitute for genuine growth. Annie's own therapy sessions provided crucial counterpoint. Her analyst helps her recognize the relationship's toxic dynamics and develop the strength to leave. The parallel therapy scenes showed two different approaches to psychological understanding: Alvy's self-indulgent intellectualization versus Annie's genuine emotional development. The film's treatment of sex and intimacy was equally revealing. The bedroom scenes between Alvy and Annie weren't romantic or erotic. They were studies in disconnection and performance anxiety. Woody had accidentally created a documentary about how neurotic men could turn even physical intimacy into an intellectual exercise while avoiding genuine emotional vulnerability. The famous scene where Annie's consciousness separates from her body during sex wasn't surreal comedy. It was a literal representation of how women in relationships with narcissistic men often dissociate to protect themselves psychologically. The scene captured the emotional violence of seemingly consensual interactions. By March 1977, Woody had assembled a rough cut that terrified him with its psychological accuracy. The film he'd intended as light entertainment had become a devastating self-portrait. Every scene contained evidence of behavior patterns he'd never consciously acknowledged. The editing process had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own character and relationship history. The decision to release Annie Hall required enormous personal courage and psychological honesty that few artists would be capable of sustaining. Woody could have easily reworked the material during post-production to make Alvy significantly more sympathetic or the relationship dynamics more conventionally romantic. He had complete creative control and could have protected himself from public psychological exposure. Instead, he made the deliberate choice to preserve the film's accidental truth-telling, even knowing it would expose him publicly as emotionally immature, psychologically manipulative, and fundamentally incapable of healthy partnership. The marketing campaign for Annie Hall strategically emphasized its charming romantic comedy elements, while carefully downplaying its darker psychological revelations. Studio executives and publicists promoted the film as witty intellectual entertainment rather than brutal relationship analysis. Audiences went into theaters expecting charming, neurotic banter and endearing character quirks, but instead received an unflinching examination of modern romantic dysfunction. The film's unexpected commercial success proved that viewers were genuinely hungry for honest examinations of contemporary relationships, even when that honesty was profoundly uncomfortable and psychologically challenging. Critics immediately recognized Annie Hall's sophisticated autobiographical elements and unprecedented psychological depth. Reviews consistently praised Woody's remarkable willingness to examine his own character and behavior patterns critically, while simultaneously creating genuinely funny, insightful, and entertaining cinema. The film established him permanently as an artist uniquely capable of transforming personal failure and psychological dysfunction into universal insight and artistic achievement. The Academy Awards ceremony in March 1978 became a significant moment of public validation for Woody's accidental confession and psychological self-exposure. Annie Hall won 4 Oscars, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Original Screenplay, and Best Actress for Diane Keaton's extraordinary performance. Woody characteristically didn't attend the ceremony, claiming he preferred playing clarinet at Michael's Pub in Manhattan to participating in Hollywood celebrations and industry networking. But his deliberate absence from the awards spoke to much deeper psychological discomfort with the public attention his emotional exposure had generated. He'd won the film industry's highest possible honors for accidentally filming his own psychological limitations and relationship dysfunction. The recognition was simultaneously deeply gratifying and profoundly mortifying. Validation that his personal failures could become profound universal art, while confirming that his most private psychological struggles were now permanent public property. Diane Keaton's Best Actress victory was particularly meaningful given the personal cost of her performance. She'd won the industry's highest recognition for having the courage to essentially play herself while reliving genuinely painful personal experiences for public consumption. Her gracious acceptance speech acknowledged the emotional difficulty of the role, while maintaining complete professional dignity despite the intense personal exposure the film had created. The film's lasting influence on subsequent romantic comedy and character-driven cinema was immediate, profound, and historically significant. Directors worldwide began exploring much darker relationship dynamics while maintaining comedic elements and entertaining storytelling. The neurotic, intellectually sophisticated but emotionally damaged protagonist became a standard character type throughout independent cinema. The innovative, fragmented narrative structure influenced countless filmmakers working in both drama and comedy. But Annie Hall's most culturally significant impact was its normalization of public conversations about psychotherapy, psychological insight, and emotional dysfunction in mainstream popular entertainment. The film showed mass audiences that romantic relationships could be examined with rigorous intellectual analysis while remaining genuinely entertaining and emotionally accessible to general viewers. The film also established an influential template for using autobiographical material as artistic source material, while maintaining some plausible deniability about specific biographical details and real-world relationships. Woody created a sophisticated method for transforming intensely personal experience into universal entertainment, while preserving minimal privacy about actual events and individual relationships. Modern audiences viewing Annie Hall often struggle significantly with its complex moral implications and psychological revelations. The film's insights about relationship dynamics remain remarkably sharp and culturally relevant, but contemporary viewers possess much greater awareness of power dynamics, emotional manipulation, and psychological abuse than 1970s audiences. Alvy's behavior and treatment of Annie seems obviously problematic and emotionally violent to current viewers, in ways that weren't immediately apparent during the film's original release. Woody Allen accidentally filmed his own comprehensive psychological profile while attempting to create light romantic entertainment, then won multiple Academy Awards for that inadvertent confession. The film that began as simple comedy became an accidental documentary about intellectual manipulation and emotional abuse disguised as sophisticated romantic connection. The Academy rewarded him for unprecedented artistic honesty, while he privately struggled with the enormous personal cost of such complete public self-exposure and psychological revelation. Modern audiences viewing Annie Hall often struggle with its moral complexities. The film's psychological insights remain sharp and relevant, but contemporary viewers are more aware of power dynamics and emotional manipulation than 1970s audiences. Alvy's behavior seems more obviously problematic now than it did during the film's original release. The #MeToo movement specifically highlighted Annie Hall as an example of how intelligent, articulate men could be emotionally abusive while maintaining public reputations as sensitive artists. Critics argued that the film's humor essentially provided cover for predatory behavior, making manipulation seem charming through clever dialogue and neurotic self-awareness. But defenders of the film argue that Annie Hall actually exposes and critiques exactly the behavior that contemporary audiences find problematic. The film doesn't celebrate Albie's emotional limitations, it documents them with clinical precision. Annie's decision to leave him represents a rejection of toxic relationship dynamics disguised as intellectual romance. Film scholars continue debating whether Annie Hall examines or exploits its autobiographical material. Does the film provide genuine insight into destructive relationship patterns, or does it simply reframe emotional abuse as romantic comedy? The answer likely depends on whether viewers focus on Alvie's perspective or Annie's experience throughout their relationship. Today, Annie Hall remains one of the most influential romantic comedies ever made, and one of the most psychologically sophisticated examinations of modern relationships in American cinema. Film schools study its innovative narrative techniques. Critics celebrate its willingness to examine uncomfortable emotional truths. Audiences continue discovering new layers of meaning in its deceptively simple story. But the film's legacy is permanently complicated by questions about artistic exploitation of personal relationships and the ethics of using real people as material for fictional characters. Did Woody have the right to recreate his relationship with Diane Keaton for public consumption? Did the film's artistic achievement justify the personal exposure it created for everyone involved? Woody Allen accidentally filmed his own psychological profile while trying to make a romantic comedy and won an Oscar for The Confession. The film that began as light entertainment became a documentary about emotional manipulation disguised as intellectual sophistication. The Academy rewarded him for artistic honesty, while he struggled with the personal cost of public self-exposure. The neurotic comedian became a cultural icon. The woman who inspired Annie Hall became forever associated with a relationship that had been painful to live and difficult to recreate on film. The accidental autobiography became a masterpiece that changed cinema while raising questions about art, ethics, and emotional responsibility that refuse easy answers. If this story gave you a new perspective, there's more coming. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next Untold moment.